Tov, today's daf is Nazir Daf Yud Zayin, Nazir 17. And we're in the middle of a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish that the Gemara is discussing a person who accepts upon himself a vow to be a Nazir while he's standing in a cemetery. So Rabbi Yochanan says that even though the Mishnah says you're not a Nazir, you don't start counting, the vow takes effect and it's looking for the first moment it could take effect. And then right when you leave the cemetery, you're basically going to start counting. So even while you're in the cemetery, the prohibitions of being a Nazir also apply in other areas. Whereas Reish Lakish says the vow doesn't take effect since you're in the cemetery. The Gemara challenges, from yesterday's daf, challenged Reish Lakish from three cases, and the challenges were apparently so strong that the Gemara on today's daf says, okay, we have to re-examine and redefine our understanding of Reish Lakish. So on 17a, 6 lines from the top, comes along Marbar Rav Ashi. Interestingly enough, so Rav Ashi is usually assumed to be the last generation of the scholars in the Talmud. So Marbar Rav Ashi is his son. So we're talking about something very, very, very late in the Talmud editing process. So Amar Marbar Rav Ashi, so the son of Rav Ashi said, okay, everybody will agree that everybody would agree that even Reish Lakish would agree that if you take a vow to be a Nazirite while you're in a cemetery, that the vow will take effect. They're only arguing about a situation as to whether or not that you're going to get lashes. They're only arguing about whether or not you're going to get lashes for the ritual impurity. We'll see how the Rush reads it. The Rush says, everybody says, and even Reish Lakish would say, you don't need to re-accept the Nazirite vows when you leave. You're automatically going to become a Nazir. And in fact, you're going to everybody agrees that you're going to get lashes if while you're in the cemetery, or even after you leave the cemetery, before you become ritually pure, if you cut your hair or drink your wine, if you're a Nazirite. The only question is that they're arguing about is whether or not you're going to get lashes for violating the prohibition of coming in contact with the dead. So Rabbi Yochanan Savar, Rabbi Yochanan's of the position that Rabbi Yochanan's going to be of the position, says the Gemara, Kivan Dechayli Laki, since the prohibition takes effect, since the Nazirus takes effect, even though while he's already Tameh, therefore he's going to also get lashes for the ritual impurity. So what we're talking about cases where he's in the cemetery, and Tosfos says that they warn him to leave, and he doesn't leave. So Rabbi Yochanan is going to say that you're going to get lashes for that, or even after you leave, after you leave the cemetery, he comes in contact with the dead. So Rabbi Yochanan says you'll get lashes for that. Reish Lakish says even though you're a Nazirite with respect to wine and a haircut, you're not going to get lashes for not leaving the cemetery or coming in contact with the dead body out once you left the cemetery before you became purified. So the Gemara says Rabbi Yochanan challenges Reish Lakish. Esvei Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. Misha Nazar v'hu bebeis hakvaros. It said in our Mishnah, somebody takes a vow in the Nazirus and they're there for 30 days. Someone takes a vow in the Nazirus and they're in their cemetery. Even if they're there for 30 days, we're not going to count that Nazirus, those days, as part of their count toward the Nazirus. The Eno may be korban tumah. And after they become ritually pure from once they leave the cemetery, they sprinkle the water, the ashes of the red heifer upon them. On their seventh day, they don't bring a carbon tumah, which they would have brought if they had been a regular Nazir, it became tamei. In this case, they don't bring it. But so the Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan would ask Rish Lakish, carbon tumah who delo ma'isi, that they don't bring the carbon tumah. But doesn't that imply that they don't bring the carbon tumah, but they do get lashes? So the Gemara says no. But din hu delisni eno lokev. It's not a proof because really it should have said that they don't get lashes. That's what it really should have said. So why doesn't it say that? Mishum de kabayla misni seifa, because it wants to say the second clause of the Mishnah. The second clause of the Mishnah states. The next clause of the Mishnah states, that if he goes out, he becomes purified, he goes back into the cemetery, then he had counted as part of counted, those days had counted for his, then the day that he became purified does count towards his minyan. And also maybe carbon tumah, and then he would bring in that case. So if he goes out and then comes back in and then leaves again to become purified, then that last day of his tahara does count as the first day for his next nazirus, and also he does bring carbon tumah. So we see under that case. Maybe carbon tumah. So since in that case we're talking about that he does have to bring the carbon tumah, tana reisha maybe carbon tumah. So therefore in the first clause we're talking about the carbon tumah, but we weren't talking about the lashes. But really he would get lashes. He would. The answer to Rabbi Yochanan, he would say Reish Lakish would say he really wouldn't get lashes in that first case either. But since it's talking about carbon tumah, that's why it refers to it. So the Gemara says, okay, we'll bring a question against Reish Lakish from a brisa. Tashma. The brisa says, Ein bein tamei shenazar or nazir tar shenidma. There's no distinction between there was a person who was tamei when he accepted his nazirus, or to a person who was tar when he accepted his nazirus, except for the following case. El shetamei shenazar. If there's a person who was tamei who became a nazir, shvi shelo olo min haminyan, then we're going to say, the seventh day, which was the day that he immersed in the mikvah, that counts towards his first day of Nazirus. And the reason is because since he doesn't have to bring the carbon tumah the next day, therefore he could already start to count. Whereas the Nazir Tahor, whereas the Nazir Tahor, the person who was Tahor when he became Tamei, his seventh day of his purification process can count towards his first day of Nazirus, is recounting, because he needs to bring the carbon the next day. Then Halamalkos, so doesn't this imply, says Rabbi Yochanan, to Reish Lakish, Halamalkos Zev is Esham, and says this is the only difference between them when you start counting your tumah. But doesn't this prove that for lashes, they're going to be exactly the same, that they both get lashes? Isn't this therefore a legitimate question against Reish Lakish? Gemara says, no, that's not what it's saying. It's saying, no, it means that they're both equal with respect to, they're both going to be equal with respect to a haircut. Meaning to say that also somebody who's tamei when he became a nazir is going to cut his hair on the seventh day of his tahara, like every nazir tahara became tamei. Every nazir who's tahara, when he becomes tamei on the last day of his purification process, the day before he cuts his hair, he brings the carbon, he cuts off his hair. And so too, this is different from the cutting off his hair at the end of his nazirus. This is the teglachas on the day of his purification, on the seventh day of his purification. And so we're going to say that's going to be the same law with respect to a nazir who was tamei when he became a nazir, and a nazir who was tahor. So we can't say that they both are going to get the lashes. So it's not necessarily a question on Reish Lakish, but the Gemara says the Gemara doesn't give up that line of reasoning. So you would say, so with respect to lashes, what we would say, you mean to say that with respect to lashes, they're different. That Nazir Tahor would get lashes, Versus Nazir Tame would not get lashes. If that's the case, Lisnaya, then it should have listed that when it said that there's no distinction. It should have listed this as a distinction. So the Gemara explains, no, betakante kamari bilkakul kamari. The Bryce was referring to ways which he purifies himself. The lashes is not a purification process. This is bilkakul. That's something that's like a punishment, meaning to say that wasn't the area where the Bryce is focusing on the distinctions. It says the Gemara. Let's bring another brisa to disprove Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says you don't get lashes in the case for Tumah when you were in the cemetery. If you accepted the Nazirus when you're in the cemetery, Tashma, Mishaya Tameh. So we're going to bring this from a brisa. If somebody was Tameh, bin Nazar, when he became and then he took a vow of Nazirus. Also, a galech v'shtos yayin. He's not going to be allowed to get a haircut, to drink wine. It says explicitly, not only is he's not allowed to cut a haircut, to drink his wine, and if he gets a haircut, drinks his wine, or he gets lashes, or he becomes tummy for the dead body, then he's going to get his lashes. So we see from here a direct refutation of Reish Lakish. So we had explained, so Tiyufta, the Gemara seems to conclude this is a refutation of Reish Lakish, and indeed we're saying that a person who was in the cemetery when he took upon himself a vow of Nazirus gets lashes. But what's the mechanics of how he gets lashes? So there are two possibilities. One is how you get lashes for a dead body while you're in a cemetery. So it could either be you left the cemetery, and even though you're still tamei, they warn you and you're not allowed to come in contact with a dead body. And if you do, you get lashes. Or it could be, as we said earlier, that you're in the cemetery and they warn you to leave, and then you don't leave. So that could be the other possibility. So hold on one second. So Tosfos talks about this. Tosfos talks about this in the Dibur Hamaskal. Hagar mechal dekolai ama chayol. So Tosfos says, "Okay, sheyitaher, when it becomes purified, ein sarach lachzor lidor ben Nazir. He's not going to need to return to take another vow of Nazirus. The chayol of Nazirus rishon." And then Tosfos continues and says, "V'chipuigi." We'll skip a few lines. Lamalki. He gets whether or not he gets lashes. Pirish atuma lachud yihasr bo atuma. Just for becoming in contact, if they warned him for that. Rabbi Yochanan Savar kivin dechayil Nazirus l'shar milei. Since there's Nazirus on all other matters for drinking wine and for getting a haircut, chayli name atuma. It's also going to apply to the ritual impurity. And here's the Tosfos says, "Im hasru bo atzeis v'lo yatsa." If they warned him to leave and he didn't leave, because the only thing we're going to say it doesn't take effect if he was already in the cemetery is that he doesn't bring the carbon, but not min malkos to tuma. But what's Rabbi Yochanan talking about? Where they warned him to leave and he didn't leave. And Reish Lakish says, even though it applies for all other areas, it doesn't apply for lashes for the tumah. Okay, but anyway, the basic point is that they warned him to leave and they did it, and he didn't leave. So Rabbi Yochanan says he's going to get lashes for that. So now, does he? The Gemara is asking the question: does he have a leeway? Does he have a time period where, if you're going to warn him to leave and he doesn't leave, we're going to give him lashes? But does he have a certain amount of time? Because the action here is passive; that he's remaining there. So Rava asked the question, Nazir v'hu b'beis kvaros ma'u. So this Nazirite, according to Rabbi Yochanan, he accepts the vow of Nazirus while he's in the cemetery, and then we warn him and say you have to leave, and he doesn't leave. Do we give him a grace period? Do we give him what's called shehiyah, pausing before he gets the lashes, or not? And so the Gemara, and the context for this is that in the Beis HaMikdash, if you become tamei from a dead body while you're in the Beis HaMikdash, we give you the amount of time it takes to bow down and to do a service to Hashem, nishtachavaya. So in this case, if he doesn't actually And if you don't pause for that time, you don't get the lashes. So the question is, does the Nazir in the cemetery also have that amount of time? Does he get Shehiyah Malchus or not, according to Rabbi Yochanan? Because Rish Lakish said he doesn't get lashes for it, but according to Rabbi Yochanan, does he get Shehiyah for these lashes? So the Gemara says, what's the scenario? If they said to him from the outset, don't become a Nazir. So if that's what they said to him from the beginning, why does he need lashes? For sure he's going to get lashes immediately because Nazir, my time will buy Shihia. What's the reason why if he was pure and he was a Nazir and he comes in contact with the dead body, he doesn't require pausing because he was warned in advance. Here also he was warned in advance. So the only question is, where is it a question? We're on top of 17b. That he entered into the cemetery while he's in a box. And then his friend comes along and removes the box from him. They remove the floor from the box. And so therefore, so when we say this concept of shehiyah, that we give you the amount of time it takes to pause before giving you the lashes, maybe that's only in the temple of Abrai, but outside the temple it has to be immediate. Or maybe we don't care. So the answer to this question is teiku, meaning to say that ultimately the Gemara hasn't answered this question, or the Gemara doesn't have an answer to this question is of do you get a period of time before we start when you've done something wrong, but you've passively done something wrong before we're going to hold you accountable. And so since the Gemara is unsure, we have to say that we better be sure that if we're doing something wrong, but we're only doing it wrong passively, we're in a situation where we're passively doing something wrong, we might be actively getting the lashes there. So therefore, we should not be passive. We should not be delaying when it comes to our passive sins. A very, very important point about the nature of sin. I want to say that might be the subject of our 1 minute daf for today. Rav Ashi has the following question. Let's say a person is a Nazirite while he's in the cemetery. So the question here is, if somebody accepts upon himself the Nazirus while he was in the cemetery, is he going to require the giluach, the shaving of the hair? And what are we talking about? So Tosfos explains to us what we're talking about. That, as we mentioned earlier in our discussion today, that that if a Nazir becomes tamei, then on the 7th day of his ritual purification process, he's supposed to cut off his hair, and the next day he brings the carbon. But this Nazirite who was in the cemetery, when he accepted his Nazirus, doesn't do the carbon tumah on the 8th day. So the question is, on the 7th day, does he also need to cut off his hair? That's the question. So the Gemara answers, does he require a haircut? Do we say kibai teglachas? Do we say when who requires a haircut? Tawar shemidma. Only a Nazir who is Tawar became tamei. Become a tamei when he's iruse because he's purifying himself from his Nazirus. Aval tamei shenazar lo. But if he was a tamei who became a Nazirite, he wouldn't require the haircut on day 7. Odoma, and that's because he doesn't bring the carbon. Tumah on day 8. Odoma, or maybe we don't make a distinction. So the Gemara says, Tashma, let's try and answer this question. Misha Nazar v'hu b'beis hakvaros. So somebody who is a Nazirite and he's in the cemetery, so somebody who's a Nazirite when he's in the cemetery, even if he was there for 30 days, it doesn't count for the counting. This is from our Mishnah. Tashma Misha Nazar v'beis hakvaros. And it also says in our Mishnah, he doesn't bring the carbon tumah. which means carbon tuma. He doesn't bring the carbon tuma on day 8 of a pirucha, but wouldn't it imply that he does cut his hair on day 7? Gemara says no. Matam kamer. No, the Mishnah is saying what's the reason why he doesn't bring the carbon tuma on day 8? Matam maybe carbon tuma mishum delo by gelucha, because he doesn't require the cutting of his hair on day 7. So for that reason, so that's the reason. Meaning to say, since we learned in our Mishnah that he doesn't bring the carbon, Memela Yadina, and Tosfos says we would know the Haba Talia, that they're both part and parcel of each other. You can't bring the carbon tuma since you didn't do the giluah, since you didn't do the shaving on day 7. So we haven't answered the question, because you could read the Mishnah that way. So the Gemara says, well, let's try and bring another proof. Tashma, we're going to bring this proof from a Brisa. Zok the Brisa. What does the Brisa say? Ein bein Tamesh Nazar, when Nazir Tarash Nitma. The Brisa says there's no distinction between a person who was Tame, who was when they became a Nazir, or with a person who was Tar when they became a Nazir. Ela Tamesh Nazir, Shvi Shalo Olo Min Minyan, except for the fact that the person who was Tame when he became a Nazir, his 7th day counts for his next Nazirus, and the reason is because he doesn't have to bring the carbon tuma. In Nazir Tarash Nitma, whereas the person who was Tar when he became Tamei, ain't Shvi Shalo Olam in a million. His 7th day does not count towards his Nazirus, and the reason is he has to bring a carbon tuma the next day. But so we see there's no distinction. My law, doesn't it imply that the only distinction is whether or not you start counting on day 7 or day 8? Doesn't this imply and that with respect to a haircut, they both cut their hair on day 7 of their purification process? Gemara says no, that's not what it's saying. Well, is that what it's saying? No, the Gemara says no. No, it's saying that with respect to lashes, to answer the question, that they both have the same answer, meaning to say that this, according to, in this way Rabbi Yochanan reads it, that just like Nazir Tar becomes Tamei, gets lashes, so too the Tamei Nazir will get lashes for the Tumah. So the Gemara says, so you mean to say that with respect to a haircut, that there is a distinction, that the first one gets a haircut, the one who was Tahor will cut his hair on day 7, whereas the one who was Tamei when he started it would not cut his haircut? If that's the case, L'snaya, why doesn't the Brisa say that? So the Gemara explains, no, Tana Shvi Shalo V'Kol Mili. No, it says the difference is 7th day and everything associated with the 7th day, which is cutting the hair. And so therefore it was implied. Okay, so now the Gemara is still trying to prove this case, the answer to our question, whether or not on day 7, if you're a Nazir Tamesh and Nazar, whether or not you're going to get lashes. Tamesh and Nazar, whether or not you're going to get a haircut on your 7th day. Gemara says, let's bring it out from the law of Tsaras. Tsaras is similar to a Nazir, and then on the day of your purification from having this biblical disease of Tsaras, you also have to shave the hair off your body. And so but when you're Mitzorah, you interrupt your count of Nazirus. That's the case. You interrupt your count of Nazirus. So the Gemara now asks the question, Tashma, we're going to bring a proof from a Brisa. Eli Ela Yemei Tumaso She'in Owen Lo Min Minyan. So I only know, says the Brisa from the Torah, that if a person is in a state of Tumah from being a Nazir, She'in Owen Lo Min Minyan, that doesn't count towards the days of his Nazirus, meaning to say that if he's a Nazir and then he got Saras, that we don't count those days where he's at Saras towards his days of, we know the halacha that if a person was a Nazir and he became Tamei from a dead body, that we don't count those days towards his days of his Nazirus, towards his quota that he has to fill. How do we know that if he was a Mitzorah, that if he had Tsaras, we also don't count those days towards his Nazirus? The Gemara says, "V'dinu, why don't we prove it from a Kal V'chomer? Just like if the person was Tamei, a Nazir was Tamei, he cuts his hair and he brings his carbon. Af Yemechiluto, so to Yemechiluto, Megalechu Mevi Karban. Also, on the day that he finishes his tzaras, he has a responsibility to cut his hair on day 1 and day 7 of his tzaras period. And he also brings a carbon for the mitzvah on day 8. And so since they both have the same law that they cut their hair and they bring a carbon, we should compare them. Just like the days of Tumah of a mitzvah of a Nazir don't count towards his quote of Naziris. Also, your days of Tzaras should not count towards your days of Nazir quota. So the Gemara says, well, that's not the way we read it. The Brisa continues. Im Amris be made to so if we're going to say that a Nazir in his days of Tumah doesn't count towards his quota for being a Nazir, because not that it doesn't count, it also nullifies the earlier days. Therefore, it doesn't count. Should we say the same thing by tzaras, where it doesn't nullify the earlier days? So therefore, those days should count towards your days of tzaras. And then the Gemara says Amris, but no, we could say Uman Nazir Bekavi, or the Brisa continues, just like somebody who was a Nazirite who accepted a Nazirite while he was in the cemetery. That such a person, when he becomes purified on day 7 of his tumah, that he's supposed to take a haircut on that day. It's part of it. He has a tiglachas, ein owen woman aminyan, and those days of tumah do not count. The days of saras and those days in the days of I lost my place here. The days of his saras she'ein ra'oi with the glachas, that his haircut during those period where it is not going to be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Naziris of cutting his hair, will call she'ein or roman for sure should not count towards the days of Naziris. So when we say the Gemara said that while he's a Nazir, it is in the cemetery. If he was tummy when he became a Nazir, that his hair is royal with tiglachas. What's it referring to? Isn't it referring to a tiglachas tumah? Isn't it referring to cutting your hair on your 7th day of your purification process in a situation where you were tummy when you became a Nazir? Isn't this an explicit answer to Rav Ashi's question? No, the Gemara says no. It's tiglachas tahara. No, we're talking about the hair growth at the very, very end of your period of Naziris. That's what we're referring to, that cutting of the hair. And indeed, it's logical to say that, because if you're going to say we're talking about the tiglachas on your 7th day of your purification process, which is called the tiglachas tumah, so you would require you're cutting your hair on that day from your tzaras. And so we see from here that the Brisa is saying that the mechiluto, that during that time period, the hair does not require tiglachas because the tiglachas come from the place of tumah. The Gemara says, no, tiglachas didn't Naziris katani. No, this is not a proof that the Brisa is talking about the tiglachas of tahara, because it's possible that it's talking about the case of tiglachas tumah. And when it says in the Brisa that during the days of tzaras his hair is not appropriate for tiglachas, that's talking about tiglachas to Nazirus. That's talking about the tiglachas of a Nazir, and that doesn't apply to Mitzorah because he doesn't require tiglachas from the law of Nazirus, but only from the law of Mitzorah. So the Gemara is going to still leave this unresolved for tomorrow to try to answer the question of Rav Ashi.